Good morning. This is the Ancient Texan. First day with my new pod mic from Rode, RODE from Australia. Well, let's hope it works well and let's hope my message is worth the money I spent on this mic. I'm a metallurgical engineer, extractive metallurgist, worked for 57, 58 years in the extractive metallurgy field. Still do some consulting. You can do the math. That makes me an old guy. Um, Still pre senile for the most part. The topic today is what my career has taught me about U.S. policies on supply chains. Or another way to put this, how to use tariffs to rebuild America in a world where China exists. Um, I started running into China in my very first job at a secondary copper smelter. We made 125,000 tons of cathode from scrap for Southwire. Um, they started buying scrap up back in the early 70s. China did. And they couldn't buy, we were on the East Coast, and so it was more expensive to get it from the East Coast, so we stayed competitive for a while. And I started noticing a trend back in the 70s. And China is unique of all the countries in the world. Um, their state priority seems to be to expand production. I can assume that's to keep people employed, but there could be more sinister reasons for that. But I don't need to speculate on the why they do it. I am just going to talk about the effect that that has. Uh, they start off with a making a metal. Generally, they have quality control problems. They gradually iron out the quality control problems. They expand production to where um, they meet all their domestic needs, and then they continue to expand. Um, Driving the price down until companies that are making the same metal have trouble competing. Um, I think there's plenty of evidence to say that they don't have a profit motive and they can continue to keep making metal, um, even if they're not profitable. And, if you know anything about economics, the marginal cost of production is quite a bit lower than the average cost. And they can sell at the marginal cost of production, even if they're, kind of close to break even. But with subsidies and low cost energy, they're effectively producing at a cost that we can't match. Not only because of the profit incentive, although I think that's the most important, um, but they also don't have the same environmental requirements, um, and they don't pay their people the same. Now, NIMBYs in this country think they've improved the world by exporting production, but if they really cared about the planet, they would look into that and they would start encouraging production in the Western world. Dig our mines in America. That or they'd quit using electricity and etc. and not drive a car and all that, all the things that come from mines. But you can't use our products, say you care about the environment, and then export production to China. That's just an oxymoron, and it's not the purpose of this discussion. But um, enough said. I'd like to look at how to rebuild our supply chains with metals. And the objectives is to use tariff to ensure a resilient and secure long-term supply of critical minerals and metals for the U.S. industry and our national defense by building a diversified, reliable, and allied, like friends, supply chains. I'd like to maximize high quality job creation across the entire U.S. economy, from mining and refining to manufacturing and technology, while supporting the overarching goal of supply security. I'd like to strengthen the economic and strategic capability of U.S. allies by integrating them into critical mineral supply chains, fostering mutual benefit and enhancing collective resilience against supply disruptions. So, I've already talked about the pattern I saw with China of continually maximizing production until it cratered um, companies that had to work with higher standards and with a profit incentive. And I'll post some stuff on here, and I think that's easy to substantiate. And there's always specifics and exceptions and all that kind of stuff. Um, and we'll get to it, but this is greatly exacerbated by the difficulty of getting a permit in the U.S. I think we need to copy Canada that gets it done in 2 to 4 years, and we take decades sometimes and don't get permits. And we need to quit being hypocrites, and we can't make everybody happy. It's a trade-off, and you have to decide that if you're going to meet global climate imperatives, if you're going to enjoy the lifestyle that we have, you're going to keep turning on your light switch. We need to make some changes and accept the fact that we need to dig holes in the ground, or you need to move somewhere that doesn't use electricity. I know we can go renewable. One day the world will be wonderful and everything will be powered by renewable. Well, if you look at the data, our total energy demand is going up faster than our implementation of renewable energy. And there's a good reason for that, but that's another discussion. The world we live in requires a lot of minerals, and in fact, a renewable world requires more minerals. That's another subject too, but it's a fact. I also take the contention that metals and minerals are kind of the building blocks for industry. Commodity metals in particular, like copper cathodes, magnesium ingots, aluminum ingots. Typically pure metals are called commodity metals, but it can also be an alloy or something that's used so much, like ferrosilicon, that might be considered a commodity, even though it's, a mixture of alloying of two different metals. And my contention is that if you build our supply of basic metals and minerals the raw materials for most of our technology, with the exception of plastics. I'll give that, but I personally prefer metals more often than plastics. I think they'd actually do less environmental harm for you NIMBY environmentalists. So my contention is that you start with the raw materials and use tariffs to rebuild our metals and mineral supplies, in particular our critical minerals that have been put on the critical minerals list. We need to rebuild that and let the rest of our industry take care of itself. Um, and I think, the downstream of putting tariffs on cars and all that is just completely nonsense. And I won't go into that either, but you can, you know, look at Ford and BMW and uh, Harley Motors and John Deere and all that are leaving the United States, and they agree with me. It's just beyond stupid. So we're not even going to discuss that. I would like to see a world um, where we were less dependent on China. I don't. China in most metals is the top producer, in many metals like rare earths. And magnesium. They're overwhelming almost all of production. So we're either dependent on them or we build up our supply. And I'm not saying tariff is a one fix all thing, as you'll see. I would say we need targeted long term tariffs, maybe forever, that are in the range of 10 to 25%. If a company can't build um, a business with that kind of cost advantage, maybe we shouldn't be building it. And I could even argue for lower than that. I think tariffs are expensive for the rest of society, and we should only do that in cases where there's a strategic security risk for not having access to that metal. As I think there is right now on many areas. Rare earths are the most popular, but stuff like nickel's pretty important too, and cobalt and manganese and lithium, uranium, even copper. I mean, we make 60% of what we need, but it's all pretty important for our long-term security. And if you look at the byproducts that come from copper production, some of those are pretty important too. Depending on the ore, there's a lot of potential byproducts, but beyond the scope of this. So we'll come back to the amount of tariffs that are needed a little bit later. But we need to also revitalize our metallurgical and mining industry. I would reestablish the Bureau of Mines that I've actually worked with, to show you how old I am, with an expanded mandate to drive research, technology development, best practices, maybe even administer or be a part of the process of administering tariffs. A modern Bureau of Mines would coordinate federal, state, and private sector efforts to accelerate breakthroughs in extraction, refining, recycling, and environmental stewardship. And it would help America compete globally and reduce its environmental footprint. It's kind of like reduce the environmental footprint per pound of metal produced. We want that to be the lowest in the world, and if you're uh, a NIMBY, pay attention. We'll also need to invest in workforce development. There's a reason old codgers like me still have consulting jobs. There's not enough young metallurgists, metallurgical engineers with extractive metallurgy backgrounds to power the revitalization of our metals industry. It's just, we're going to have to depend on some of our allies like Canada and Australia to give us manpower to even start this effort. The idea that a U.S. is self-sufficient ignores the fact that we've destroyed our expertise. I always used to say the first generation, ships the plants and technology to China. In the second generation, we lose the expertise, and we're in the third generation, so figure it out. We need to streamline the permitting process. I'm told Canada has a good system and gets it done in 2 to 4 years. There needs to be an overall coordinator, perhaps the Bureau of Mines, and it needs to drive things to a conclusion. And NIMBYs have to get on board that if they want America to continue existing, I actually think our shortages of critical metals is actually more of an existential crisis than climate change. But that's a whole nother discussion. But as a metallurgist that's watched this industry for 60 years and seeing where it's come from and where it's going to, we don't function as a society when you run out of critical minerals. I know that's a bold statement, but I think it can be supported. And I also believe that we have to leverage allies and partners, exactly where the cutoff line is when you need some help from someone else, whether you call them a friend or an ally. And I think in general, allies and U.S. controlled overseas operations need to get a heavy discount on tariffs. I'm saying they pay 40% of the standard rate. So if the rate's 10%, they would pay 4%. So, or if the rate was 25% on a particular metal, they would pay whatever 4% of 25 is 10%. So here's a system I would use, and I think it's fairly straightforward. For critical metals and minerals where we produce less than 10% of our needs, I would put a 25% tariff on those materials. If our production with a critical mineral exceeds 50%, I would drop the tariff down to 10%. So I'd still keep a little bit of tariff to keep building up the metals industry. But I think 10% is not overly burdensome, but it would still help develop our metals industry. So 25% on those metals that we produce less than 10% of, 10% tariff on things that we produce more than 50% of our needs. That's obviously a little bit arbitrary, but they're not insane numbers, or the concept I think is valid. I think, if this policy starts working, and I think we're talking decades, at least, you know, 5 years before we see the needle move, we should review this policy every year and set tariffs for 10 years into the future. This would give industry something solid to plan with, and a solid methodology to get um, reductions in import rates. For instance, you get the import rate is 40% on allies and friends that we think we need their help. And like everything's negotiable. But we also need stability in the market. So you set these up for 10 years, leave them alone. 10 years later, you review it, set a rate for the next 10 years forward. I think we have to be very realistic about time frames. It's taken us 60 years to get into this mess. It's going to take a few decades to get out of this mess. We need a strong base of allies like Canada, Australia, probably a lot of the European Union. And one final comment is the tariff proposal that I've got written up here that I'll somehow link and let everyone have access to. Is comprehensive, long term. It's not a quick fix. It recognizes that we need sustained investment, policy innovation, and willingness to make pragmatic trade offs. I think Democrats have to lead the effort to reduce the time it takes to get something permitted, just like they need to work on, getting rid of the restrictions to construction in California to get rid of the homeless problem. They've got the problem there; it's right in front of them. The NIMBYs need to figure out what their priorities are. Homeless, or you keep your big castle and blocks around it nice and shiny with your black hearts inside. Uh, pardon those comments. But anyway, it's a long term job that needs help from our allies and friends. And we need to stay committed to it for a long time and understand the problem of being dependent on China for critical metals and minerals. And unfortunately, the way humans learn, we probably need some empty shelves and some, lack of iPhones coming across the ocean because we're short of rare earths or something, drastic like that for us to pay attention to critical minerals and metals. But those examples will be coming. And so when they come, my final comment is let's get busy securing American metal supply. I'd love to work on a task force for this. I've seen a lot in my 60 years, and I think I could be instrumental in drawing up something that actually would work. I'm not completely ignorant on the other parts of life outside of metallurgical engineering. Anyway, this is the Ancient Texan hoping that this simple proposal and there's a little more details in the written version. Could be used as a template for drawing up something that could actually work in America instead of the nonsense we're doing right now. Anyway, this is the Ancient Texan. Hope you have a good one. Namaste.